the Aspen Institute. I want to welcome our online audience as well. Every communications conference has a communications glitch. Ours started with a notice that went out Eastern time rather than Mountain time, so if people have been waiting for 2 hours, we welcome you. This is a very important conference to the Aspen Institute. You are part of the Aspen Institute Communications and Society program, which is one of our 30 policy programs. And this conference is really our premier conference. It's a little larger than most of our roundtables, but it is aimed to really advance democracy and communications, which is our focus, and really follows up some work we've done with the Knight Foundation for a long time, leading towards informed and engaged communities. We work with the Knight Foundation to bring about the Knight Commission on the Information Needs of Communities in a Democracy. And really coming out of that, we've been focusing our FOCAS conference on the issues of open governance and how citizens can both learn more and act more with their governments. So we thank the Knight Foundation, Michael Maness, and John Bracken and Chris Soper, who are all here. And Carol Coletti. Did I get that wrong? Coletta. Who's we welcome as well. Our conference today will be, and for the next 3 days, will be not only on developing tools for engaging citizens, but going beyond what is effective, what do we need going forward, and how do we institutionalize those, not necessarily in one institution, but that we can find homes for this and ways of encouraging both citizen demand and engagement for interaction with its government, and ways of having government information available to citizens and tools available to engage with their, between the governed and the governing, the governors, the government and the governed, as Alec Ross reminds us. This conference, as we said, is streamed. So usually Aspen roundtables are off the record. This is on the record because obviously we're public. We're happy for that, and we hope to have feedback. Our Twitter hashtag is FOCAS13, and it's FOCAS 13, and we'll look forward to seeing a Twitter stream on this. As we engage with each other, we have a large group, as I said. We ask that, since we want to engage as many people as possible, that you not speak for more than 3 minutes at a time, and even that's pushing it. To be called on, if you'll put your 10 cards up, I'll be able to see that you want to get in, and we'll try to get you roughly in order, though not necessarily. Sometimes we need to keep the conversation going and bring in somebody who's really on that point. If you do have an urgent point you want to make, if you put up 2 fingers, we might be able to bring you into the conversation at that time, and again, not guaranteeing. And borrowing from the unconference approach, so that we don't have redundancy, if somebody said something and you like it and you want to do this, that's fine as well. We want to, since we have so little airtime in the general session, if you can keep your remarks to something new and advancing the dialogue rather than just repeating what somebody else says. My other Aspen rules are we ask that you not use acronyms without first explaining them. And second, that there not be interference in the sense of first, putting your cell phones on vibrate, but also, even more importantly, not talking to your neighbors during the actual sessions. We have plenty of time at the breaks and at dinner for you to engage one-on-one with each other, and if you can show the respect to those who are speaking by not speaking to your neighbor, it really helps. So I just urge you not to do that. Okay, with that said, let's get going, and as I mentioned, we are very grateful to the Knight Foundation, not only for its support of and partnership over the years in this activity, but for its leadership and initiative in what they're doing in open governance. And to welcome us and get us going, I'm pleased to welcome and introduce Michael Maness, the Vice President of the Knight Foundation, who oversees this open governance area. Michael.
Great. Thanks, Charlie. First of all, thank you from the Knight Foundation for attending and joining us here. I know everyone, especially here, is super busy, and we appreciate taking a good chunk of your time, especially in the summer, to come and spend some time with us. Some of you were here last year for something that had similar, a gathering that we had that was really similar in many ways into the topic area that we're talking about. It was featured around open government. And what we found in those conversations was a lot of disparate strategies, a lot of different small nascent initiatives going on, not necessarily a lot of dialogue between people who are in that space. We saw a lot of soft things come out of last year in terms of conversation that people had in the groups. For example, a lot of the White House work with GitHub came out of conversations with Max and Macon from last year. So those things are important, but we also really saw the opportunity to begin to try to build a comprehensive identity around what the open government work is. And so one of the things that we took away from last year is we had the Knight News Challenge on open government this last for the first one this year, first of two that we're having this year, and that was focused on open government because a lot of the conversations that we had last year, and in fact, when we were reviewing a little bit of what came out of last year, we recognized that some of the News Challenge winners actually were addressing issues and problems that we discussed as a group last year. So we see that as a really positive thing. Why the Knight Foundation is intrigued and supporting this area is that it hits across many of the things that Knight does. So Knight, our goal is to create informed and engaged communities. The open government movement has a lot of things that hit across that. So from our community standpoint of engagement, it makes a lot of sense about lowering the barriers of entry to citizens. From my program, from the journalism side, what's really vital about this is we know now that the number of working journalists in newspaper newsrooms is at 1978 levels. There's $5 billion of payroll that's been taken out of newsrooms in the last 5 years. We're seeing the impact, especially at the state level in terms of coverage of government and the ability for anyone to have shoe leather to go in and pull data and build those databases or do investigative work and enterprise work in the space. So it moves from all the way from making sure that there's a watchdog component, that there's data, free flow of data that journalists or active citizens can use, all the way to making it easier for you to manifest and have an impact on what's going on in government. So that's one of the reasons that we see the space is really exciting. It fits across a lot of the spectrum that what we're doing. And also today we're announcing, the press release just went out on a grant that's part of our portfolio around this to Project Madison. And Seamus Kraft is here with us from the Open Government Foundation. And Project Madison, Project Madison is we're excited about not only the content and what the approach, the content and the approach for it, but also the way that Seamus is launching it. So Project Madison seeks to enable citizens to impact legislation as it's being crafted and created, and allow representatives and government representatives and citizens to interact around the legislature itself, around those laws actually being created. The pilot, the focus is, this is one of the things I like about it a lot, is that we're focusing on Maryland. They've already done a lot of work with Maryland in terms of the code there, but also focusing on a municipal and state level about rolling this out to get people really active involved with it. So it follows a slate of different open government work that we've done so far this year. We're not only the News Challenge, but the NYU Government Lab, a grant to the Sunlight Foundation, and obviously multiple grants that we have, small grants as well as we launched another 6 prototype grants as well out of this in terms of the space. So it's something that we feel it's still nascent, it's still fragile, and that the way that we can approach it and impact it is really key. So one of the things that we hope to accomplish over the next couple days, and you can see the efforts around us, and I don't know if you want to throw that up on the screen, but we've begun to create a systems map of the open government space. And Andrea already told me, she said it looks quasi-mystical. And it does look quasi-mystical. And it's really just a first attempt to get our arms around all the moving parts and a recognition that this is operating at multiple levels with multiple players, different funders. It is a complex space. And there's the opportunity to attack and focus on those different areas is really the point of the map. It's not to say it's not exactly easy to follow along with. It's not supposed to be. It literally is a systems map of what we see. It's not finished. It's our first draft of it. We want to work on it here over the next couple of days and also make sure that it's eventually publicly available. And our hope is over the next couple of days we can enrich it. The one on the right, on the big ones over here in the room, are that one has more detail to it. The one on the left, we're going to give you Post-its. And as we go on, things that are gaps, things that you would change, the one on the left you can impact, and if you want to write on it on the actual map, you can as well. And the hope is to, again, start to define and build a comprehensive approach to the space so that we're not duplicating efforts, that everyone's aware structurally of what everyone else is doing, and also to start to create a network of people who are engaged in this space and understanding where they fit and the entire ecosystem of what we're trying to accomplish with open government. So I won't go into much detail because you can chew on it. You can see how it's gone so far. And again, it's not the most user-friendly version of this, and it's not supposed to be. Again, it's supposed to be a diagnostic, and then we'll roll out more and more. We'll take different areas of it, explode those out, make it much more user-friendly as we move forward. So again, thanks for being here, and we really hope that over the next couple of days we can come out with some exciting ideas towards that. The one other note I would say is last year we had some people who were developers and makers in the room, and we found that to be incredibly positive and impactful. There's more of you or them, depending on who you are, in the room. And what the point of that is we're trying to get actionable things coming out of this and also making sure that there's a high level of achievable technological, pragmatic discussions that happen with this. So, and as we go on, the next couple of days, this is very focused on hopefully an arc that moves from conversation and getting focused and having ideas of what's going on in the areas to much more actionable insights and potentially technologies and approaches that we can build. And that's one of the goals that we hope to happen over the next couple of days as well. So, Charlie?
Great. Let me just add one thing at the beginning, which is not only has Madison Project come out of last year's conference, or the relationship, obviously the project is older than that, or was conceived before that, but I also understand that the countries of Brazil and Estonia have established a relationship really coming out of the appearance here last year from the president of Estonia and Tiago Pacheto, who is here and will be here and will be arriving later this morning. So we never know what the exact relationships are going to be coming out of this. And we hope that there'll be some important new ones coming out of this conference. What I want to do this first session is to play out where are we in the world of open governance. And Michael, I actually would like, if you could just walk us through a little bit. It's a little hard to, we've got here in the building, we have these printed copies, but it's a little small, it's a little hard to read for us old guys. Most of the people here have better eyes than I do. But maybe you could walk it through a little bit. And then what I'd like to do is have the rest of us kind of fill in what is happening with open governance, where are we, what's our, kind of give us a little status report at the federal, state, and local levels. And then later in the session, we're going to turn and get a little presentation from Gavin Starks, who's here from the Open Data Institute at the UK, because we want to look particularly at what they're doing there and what are the analogs in the US throughout this 3-day session. And then in the second session of this morning, we'll go into what are some of the cultural barriers, which I find usually, in this world, we can find the technology to build whatever we want, but we also find that there are barriers, and often they're cultural or institutional or whatever, any barriers to bringing about the kind of open governance that we want to see. So, Michael, maybe you could.
Sure. So on this, you'll see on the left, basically there's the notion of citizens or users, depending on how you want to define that, and government data on the right. And between the thing that links that and the reason that that has always been there. Obviously, that's universal with citizens and government. But the technology and the disruptive ability that's happened with the internet is why we see this expanding and what makes it exciting. So the technology forms the hub of the middle of this. And the notion is there's a lot going on between trying to figure out how that technology and citizens interact with the government, from data to tools. There's and within those, there's a complex set of problems. One of the things that we know is a big deal is data standards. Even if you have municipal governments that are being very open or states that are open, some people see SUVs as cars, some see SUVs as trucks. Right there, a very small thing makes a vast difference of output depending on what goes on. So there's the kind of traditional citizens government divide on that with technology in the middle. And then at the top, we also know, and when you have a lot of conversations with people who are active in the space that are elected officials, the private sector on this, where there's various degrees of private sector technology that work in this, that some are super beneficial, others make the data private to the companies, and the government actually has to go back and then pay for the data that it gave to the company to begin with. So there's a lot of complexity in that space. There's a lot of IT business around it. And so the notion is we're trying to capture that kind of galaxy as well. And then underneath there, the notion of, on the bottom, is of civil society, which is what goes on that technology could enable or not. But the notion there's engagement between those. So there's NGOs involved in the space, there's funders, academics, and then you move into political parties and activists, and in fact, people who are working in government are of course part of civil society as well. So it's not very, each of these is meant to be overlapping. It is, each of these spaces should be fuzzy because it tends to be gray. And you can see the notion, we've tried to do some broad things around what government functions are around on the right, and then who we see as players so far in this space. And ultimately, this feels a bit more static than we'd like, I think, but it's again meant to be the first effort at a map of that. So the notion is ultimately that we have citizens and government, and then technology, private business, civil society, nonprofits, all operating in some way between those two orbits.
Okay, so let's start off by seeing if anybody wants to even comment. It is small. So if anybody has any comments, and Stefan, I'm going to kind of allude to you, because Stefan Verhulst is at the GovLab at NYU, and is a great taxonomist in these various spaces, and just thought maybe you have an initial thought about the mapping.
Does it work?
I think they'll yeah.
Great. Well, congratulations with the map, meaning I always like maps, and so whenever I see a map, I'm happy. So you make my day. And every map has its challenges in being comprehensive or being too comprehensive. So meaning I think it's a great effort. We actually also developed a map to try to identify what open governance is all about, and it became a prism, which is a bit of an embarrassment right now, given the prism context. But actually, if you look at it, it's really more Moby Dick than anything else. So I think it's very much aligned. The difference with the map that we developed to a certain extent was, and again, this is not like one map is better than the other map. It's going to be hard to actually be comprehensive. Is that to a certain extent it focused very much on technology and not on the objectives. And so that's a little bit of the worry that I have here, is that it becomes technologically driven, which to a certain extent, of course, open governance is all about technologically enabled innovation. So that's correct, but it's a part of achieving an objective, which is ultimately about improving people's lives through actually making governance more open or more effective or more legitimate. And I think somewhat the objectives are missing here, which makes it hard to then judge what the ultimate outcome is going to be and how you're going to measure success with regard to the use of the technological means that you have here. Besides that, there are also, besides technologies, there are also all kinds of practices that are technology enabled, which are innovative, go from crowdsourcing to behavioral economic kind of new ways of nudging people, which are also part of the lingua franca of open government, which are technology enabled, but also enabled by new insights in science and social science. And so that's also something that you may want to think about. Where does it fit on the map?
Okay, great. Andrew Stott.
I was about to wave my hand because I agree very much with the point about technology. I think that, and you know, full credit to Michael for putting something up that we can throw rocks at. I think the thing that's missing for me for it is the sense of a cycle. That there is government opening data, getting back to feeding back to government, and then government actually doing something about it. And in a sense, some of the work that's been done and the technologies that have come out have been concentrated on that flow from government to citizens. And that flow back is an area that needs, I think, a lot of development. And that's raised by the background reading. Why are some of these great ideas not actually becoming sustainable, or not involving enough people, or not actually making a difference to government?
Okay, great. Max Ogden. And I'm just, while I'm going around, if people will put their card to call on you. Yeah, thanks.
So in that center area, the technology that is kind of common to all the different outlier groups, I think one of the things that could be underscored there more is how each one of those has to emphasize that it enables collaboration. I think that's a really important goal for each one of those technologies. For instance, the one that says like software platforms, I think. Something like GitHub, a dream that I've had in open government for years now, is that I can send a pull request to my city or to my state or to my federal government. If I find a problem, the onus is on me as a citizen just as much as the government employee in the IT department to fix the problem. It's only recently that that's starting to happen with initiatives like healthcare.gov. They have one of the simplest sites in terms of architecture. So any citizen, it's not beyond the technical. Healthcare.gov, patching it, sending healthcare.gov a new contribution. So it's almost like they're scaling out their collaborative process so that anybody that knows how to use GitHub can help improve the actual software that runs on government. So GitHub is a really pioneering force in software collaboration, but I think if we look at how do the technologies enable collaboration between the sectors, that'd be a really interesting source of conversation.
Excellent. Brian?
We're hoping that it acts as a catalyst site that's as visible as healthcare.gov. Hopefully it'll expand quickly. What I wanted to do was just expand quickly on Stefan's point, and actually related to a conversation that Chris Sofer and I had on the plane yesterday. So Chris was telling me about how when he used to live in DC, you would that happened in DC, legislation, any of this open gov stuff, would be topics of conversation that people could have together. But when he moved down to Miami, it just sort of disappeared, right? People don't pay attention outside of the Washington bubble to a lot of this stuff. And so I look at the map and I see this big bubble of citizens on the left-hand side. But to me, citizens is something that we need to think about in a much more fragmented way. You know, there are people in this room, people like us, who care about this stuff pretty deeply, think about it on a regular basis. But the vast majority of people in this country probably don't know much about what we're doing. But yet could be an effective part of the process if we thought about them as an effective part of the process and design tools, design systems, design processes that were geared towards addressing a cultural shift in the way that people interact with both state, local, and federal governments.
Yeah.
And so I just think that it's important to think about citizens in a more fragmented and broader context.
I'm realizing I should identify people when I call them.
That's right, yeah, sorry.
At the federal government. I'm hoping that over the next 3 days, we can also be looking at ways of encouraging people to just get involved. I think that's what you're saying, but what are incentives for people to become more engaged in their local, and I think we'll look a lot at local as well as the federal level. And I know Evan Smith just raised his card. Maybe you wanted to, did you want to address that very point? I'd like to. Okay, and just a reminder to get the mics. It is a big room, so we're going to need to talk into the mics.
Thank you. I want to get in on what Brian was saying about the need to give, it's not simply enough to give people access to information. There's got to be a link in the chain that connects average people to the information being made available by governments. I think what is not adequately represented on this map, or whether it's nonprofit media in the emerging space and running the Texas Tribune, I certainly have a bias for the latter. I think it's important that the media organizations be engaged in communities around the country to connect average people to data that they may not know is available to them, may not know that they have access to. The recent example from my perspective is the live stream of the Texas abortion debate that we provided to people that reached 183,000 people at its peak on the night of that debate around the world, was available from the legislature itself. But until a media organization got in the business of distributing that stream to a wider audience and making people aware that it was available, no one actually knew that it existed. And so I think that role is maybe underplayed on this map. You've got to have that link in the chain, otherwise you can't get citizens to the data or to the open government or to the transparency.
Good, very good. Ellen Miller, so.
Because nobody else can. I can't read this. I can read this, which I think is terrific. I mean, is your basic schematic, and what's underneath it is still hidden to me, but I'd like to take a look at it, because I think there's tremendous value in doing this. And I think, so I want to sort of go back just a little bit, Charlie, to your first question, which is government. And I think, I mean, I certainly can say this, none of us were involved in this kind of work. We certainly didn't label it open governance 6, 7, 8 years ago. It didn't exist as a field. So I think there has been tremendous progress, and all of us, especially those who are focused on the federal side, could chronicle the substantial changes that have been made, some in rhetoric, some in fact, some in reality, in terms of opening up government, however that's defined. But the problem, of course, has these two sides. One is getting government to do what it is reluctant to do, doesn't know how to do, doesn't want to do any of those, and then having citizens getting, the patronizing way to say it is getting citizens to engage, but working in the citizen sector space so that they know that having healthcare data in their hands or on their wrists is really a useful thing to them, but also the capacity to reach out to their elected representatives at all levels and say, why did you vote this way? Or talk to me about that, or I have an idea about how our budget should be spent. So there's these two sides of the problem, and I think there's tremendous progress being made on both sides of those. What I'm not sure is here, and to me it's the most exciting, it's one of the most exciting pieces of this, is the role for entrepreneurs. It's the Katrias, who didn't exist 2 years ago. She had a really good idea. It's the Turbo Votes, it's the Code for Americas, it's the Muck Rocks, it's the, hundreds, indeed, if not thousands of people who have an idea for opening government and engaging citizens in that. So I don't know whether that's a factor here, but I think the depth of that will be the source of the creativity that we see in this field.
Okay, very good. Michelle?
Couldn't read the other side. I think I spent too much time looking at my computer. So I flipped the page over, and I saw what was really interesting to me about this diagram at the broad level is that there's an orange shape funneling into this blue dot in the middle, and then there's a purple shape funneling out. And I think that hourglass shape, that bottom, because over the past few years, we've seen so much activity on each side. So change.org rallying people to sign petitions or get in touch with lawmakers. So much activity on Twitter and Facebook, lots of organizations, institutions reaching out there. And then on the other hand, we have so much open data being released. It's really, really heartening to see. But I think where we have to put a little more scrutiny is how these connect. So whether it's through how media bridges the gap between the two, or designing better ways of collaboration, maybe borrowed from technology, maybe not. I think looking more closely at how this two-way arrow actually functions in both directions is going to lead us to the next level.
Good. I think that's those two elements, and I think particularly these last comments, we've got activity at the federal level, maybe not enough, maybe we need action there. We've got some activity at the citizen level, and there's new activity, but maybe not enough. How do we encourage more? And it's not all technology, but there is that fulcrum that has to be addressed, that intermediary or the point of connection. I'm just basically going around, so Clay Johnson next. Thanks.
Thanks. Is this on?
The people will get it on.
Okay, cool. So I have a couple things. One is predictably the sort of private sector IT business part of this map that apparently only I can read is I don't envy the person who would need to actually do this in the right way. It's the sort of contracting to government, with government, working with government is a convoluted system that desperately needs more detail to mapping. I feel like to an extent what we're doing is going around the room and picking our sort of quadrant of the map and saying, you should add more detail here. And a crayon to just draw the scribble that will be hopefully the portion of this map, because it's very convoluted, but it desperately needs stuff. So for instance, more often than not, Google does not sell directly to government. In fact, I think that I may not be correct on this, but I think I heard that they never sell directly to government, that they're always selling through resellers to government, through other contractors and stuff like that. And so I think if we're going to support these entrepreneurs, and if we're supporting folks like Recovers and other organizations like that, then we've got to get a good grasp of how that system actually works, so that we can sustain these entities, and so that they have a better understanding of how to actually walk in the door and sell to government, while not enabling, I think, the sort of set of toll booth owners that we've sort of set up for ourselves already. Toll booth owners, I mean prime contractors who are basically reselling small businesses' services and adding no value to it, to government entities. To the question of, where are we? I generally think that the open government community, myself included, do a pretty bad job of sort of steering the ship and understanding where I care a lot less about where it is that we are, and I care a lot more about where it is that we're going. And I think that we're not very good at that. I think that in general, the open government community has either been about reacting to things, putting out fires, or doing what sounds good. But I've yet to see a cohesive vision for this community from anybody in this community of, the question I've been liking to ask people is, if you could win every fight that you pick for the next 5 years, how would my life be different? And write me a story about how my life would be different as a result of the ultimate success of your work. And let's work backwards from that.
Okay, so Katria O'Neill, recovered. Answer that question.
I was actually going to go in a different direction.
Okay.
Boom.
But, just briefly on that, we are scrambling to get away from selling to government because it's so hard. So most recently, we've been working with insurance companies because they understand that you need to have systems in place that can reduce claims, right? So we had to go find a private sector person who is easier to work with to get through those problems. And like Clay, but we're not quite there yet to the point where small businesses with a staff of 3 can sell to the federal government without a large, nice uncle of like Cisco or something like that. But I kind of wanted to push a little bit further into the spiderwebby thing in the bottom left, which says social networks, and then address whether or not technology is the only way to share information about government. I think Brian's point about having people, having citizens as part of the process that we're trying to outline here is really important. And we can, if we look at implementation, make them an interface of sorts. The level of internet saturation in the United States, the amount of people who actually interact with social or social policy information or government information is not that great. And we're making progress, but we're not quite there. But what is awesome is the amount of people on Facebook and the fact that if you are posting political information, it's reaching people who don't care, but they're still going to get that information, or that maybe they'll be prompted to do something about it. So, for example, during the filibuster in Texas, I had no idea what was going on because I live under a rock for all matters except relating to my business. And I found out through Facebook, which I was checking because I do that every day, that it was going on, watched some videos, thought it was awesome. Taking things even further offline, conversations among community members in a location is the oldest social network we have, and we completely ignore it. One of the things that we direct people to do in dead zones after disasters, when there's no internet connectivity, you can't make a cell phone call, texting works sometimes. We have people outside of the dead zone on Facebook. We send people information to print off and walk with flyers through a dead zone community to share information. And we reach them through social media. We're glad that some people are online, but they're also effective as an interface in that information exchange about government services. So I think there's opportunity to explode that bottom left quadrant in ways that don't have anything to do with technology.
I think that's a really good. Around this table tends to be technology oriented. We've selected because that's where the advances are. But we're really talking about social networks, not necessarily electronic social networks. And we're talking about citizen engagement, not necessarily technological citizen engagement. So these several comments that have been going around, I think, are really important reminders to that what is the end goal here, and it's engagement. And it's engagement and action. Philip Ashlock, civic agency.
So I'm probably going to be sort of repeating or summarizing what a number of people have already said, but when I was, I chatted with Marshall, I think, who was working on this at the Civic Media Conference a couple weeks ago, and the main thing that seemed to be missing, at least in that draft, I think there's more of it now, was just what open government even is. And I feel like mostly this is focused on the different people and organizational entities in this space. There's open government is, but I think at a higher level, it'd be better to sort of try and map out the different sort of, different focal areas around what open government actually is. I mean, if you look at different sort of parts of the map, it seems like the repeated word is data, and I think in general, I think there's almost consensus that there's maybe even too much emphasis on sort of open data being like the fundamental part of open government. And I also think technology being sort of the center of this kind of reinforces a sort of almost technocentric view of the world that we all share. That's probably not always helpful in many cases. And we often get into situations where it's very clear that technology isn't so much what's needed to solve some problem, but it's cultural change. And I feel like if culture was at least as much a part of the center of this map as technology, that would probably be a little bit more representative of the more long-term changes that are necessary to achieve some of the goals here. And I also, as a sort of metric, I think, of the current state of open government, you could probably list on I guess it would be on the supply side, how governments have responded to some of the demand in terms of actually codifying open government principles into law. I guess it's almost 3 years ago now, put together a post called The State of Open Government that was going through like basically the different policy areas around open government. So not just open data, but transparency and accessibility, to try and list the different ways that different cities and different parts of government had actually established laws that codified and put metrics around sort of living up to these principles. So I think that's maybe another way of sort of showing the current state. I almost think this has to be sort of a three-dimensional map where you have the different players on one plane and the actual what it is that they're working on another plane.
So let me just say that I think it's very, and you're you're opening it up and having it's a great starting point for a discussion. I think we appreciate that, and we are taking some pot shots, but I don't think I think it's all constructive in terms of what are we doing here. Story Bells from City of Philadelphia.
Thanks for the great setup, Phil. I think one of the issues that we need to think about is how we actually talk about this work and what's the language that we use. And so much of it is focused on activity or tools or data as opposed to the problems that we're trying to solve. And I think that we could engage a much larger audience in understanding the value and the potential for open government if we start to talk about impact and the problems that we're solving as a picture of data and transparency. I think we need to get to a really granular level and start to talk at a language that kind of evens the playing field.
I mean, Brett Goldstein and has moved out to the University of Chicago.
So I have 3 turbo comments. So the first one, being the CIO for the city of Chicago, I did, let's just say, quite a bit of procurement. Do not give up on the procurement process. It's fine. It can be much better. The solution is you don't want to stop the interactions, because I know, being a CIO, I wanted more options, better options, more nimble options. If the dialogue shuts down, we're really not going to be able to improve this. Something to keep in mind, and we do need to work to improve it. The second point, so people know I have a bit of a sort of bias to the data side of things. So I want to make sure, as we're sort of considering where we're going and we're talking about better engagement and things like that, that we don't lose sight of the real work that still needs to be done to make open data work. And I do think open data
needs to stay as part of the conversation because honestly, it's the foundation for much of what we do. I've spent the past 2 years sort of taking Chicago from really not having an open data program to now having one of the bigger ones out there. And it's enormous work and it's a mundane topic, but to make the technology do it, we need to accept that most governments have enormous legacy systems. They're disparate, they don't make sense, there's poor documentation, and if you're gonna have sustainable open data, okay, it's important, sustainable open data that requires some real technology or lots of other things fall apart. So I would hope as we talk about sort of sexier use cases and things like that, we couple it with how do we allow more governments to do open data? Because there's two things, there's CCAN and SECRETA. How do we make it easier, and how do we make it that if someone wants to get their ERP data, oh, I violated one of Charlie's rules, the financial systems data out onto the platform, how do you prevent it from costing $50,000 or something like that? That's important. The third piece is this idea of, and this was mentioned before, marketing with this. How do we tell the story? If, when they lined me up to do press, if I was talking about predictive analytics, everyone wanted to hear the story. They're like, great prediction, that's really exciting in government. Let's talk about use cases with open data. You won't get many hits. One of the things we need to do is tell a better story and find a way to market it outside of our cohort here, because we all get it. But why is it not a story in the New York Times or in Time Magazine, and sort of get at the cycle of how this will change government, make it better? And I think that's something we should press ahead on.
Very good. Let me bring back, and I know there's some overlap from last year, and those who aren't here can get the report online at the Aspen Institute website. And two elements came out of that have come up. One is procurement, and we did come up with some suggested solutions, and some of these things don't necessarily move right away. They may take some time, but we did have some streamlined solutions for procurement that I think maybe be worth looking at again. But the second, that was a theme that went through last year's conference, was the importance of narrative, and also transmedia narrative building that kind of captivated the conference last year. And I think we should keep that in mind as we think through what is the narrative. I mean, from Clay talking about what is the goal, you know, it can also be expressed through a narrative, and the importance of self-governance. Mark Meckler's, his organization's about self-governance, and there's so many different people who have grabbed that from the founding. And for those who weren't there last night, Walter Isaacson welcoming this group talked about the founding of this country and the importance of, he looked at media, but also self-governance. And that's a narrative that is really part of the American story that I think we can give some life to. Next is, was over there, yeah, Joel Mahoney.
I'd like to go back to Ellen Miller's point about how new this space is. I think it's really exciting. Looking around this room, this is a really interesting mix of people here. The whole concept of civic entrepreneurship is a kind of fascinating thing that, we're all of us founders here are also citizens, and these sustainable companies are a way to kind of really force a certain kind of change in government. To that point, a topic that I'd love to address, in this forum is the issue of funding. And I think about the Knight Foundation, and they're really helping to create this space. But looking ahead, thinking about aspirations in the space and kind of a balance of these different sectors. I think the funding issue is a really central one to a sustainable effort. Is the funding coming through the procurement process directly from government? Is it coming from foundations like Knight? Will private investors, efforts in this space, and how does that balance affect what private companies might try to do with a civic intent? And as an example, like I'm starting a company. I would love to, I'd love to be able to consider like an Instagram play, a typical consumer play where you're not so focused on revenue right away. You can scale knowing that there will be a certain kind of reward for your efforts at the end, whether from through an acquisition or from investors. I think the model so far is very much foundation funding or selling directly to government, which is a very slow cycle. So, for instance, with this map, it would be really interesting to see the extent of the funding sources on this map. How much money is flowing into technology from government, from civil society, and from the private sector, and how is that affecting the balance of open government as a whole?
So I think to its credit, in terms of the map, they importance of the private sector, and at least as I see it, they envision someday, again, Clay, going to what is the vision? I think they envision someday a robust industry in providing data. Now, whether that's for-profit or non-profit, I think that there'll be different models. But it's great that you're getting into it, and I think over the next few days we can start exploring some of that. Alyssa Black from the New America Foundation.
I want to get back to the map a little bit and something that Stefan said in the beginning about objectives missing from it. And I think what could be interesting to add to the map might be user functions. So this idea of like, what's the role of citizens in this? Because when I look at it, I see like consumer and producer. So there's this like dynamic that we've set up between residents and government. And so maybe getting at that through user functions or somehow identifying like, what are the outcomes of open government and what are we, it's for improving lives, but how do we articulate that and then how do we measure ourselves against that? And then something else that Evan said that I thought was really interesting and I've been thinking a lot about is this role of translators and that media plays that role. And I think technology plays that role too, and it can scale at a rate that maybe media can't. And that's why we kind of focus on it. But there's a role for kind of, or at least I'm interested in, how do we create more translators and how do these groups within civil society help translate open government to residents? Because the work that I've done in the past, I don't often see individual residents interact with government. And so I kind of like, the user to me was like, is the user a resident? Because I don't often see individual residents understanding how to use open data. And so technology can help in translating that. Bus apps really help get open data into the hands of an individual resident. But how can we, as a group with all these different skill sets, create more translators for open government?
Great. In our background readings saying, is this stuff really effective? Panthea.
Thanks. So I wanted to...
We need a mic over there.
Oh, sorry. Thank you. So I guess touching a little bit to the themes in that piece, but also to pick up on what Brian was saying earlier. And noticing that all of the, the private sector, civil society, government are relatively well, they're broken down in terms of the different groups there, in terms of the different, bodies and characteristics that we might think of. But in terms of citizens, we're looking at them in terms of socioeconomic status and technological literacy, which I think is really telling for a group of, technologists. In thinking about the characteristics that I think are most relevant to us. And I think sometimes when we even talk about socioeconomic status, we think in terms of education, which then means tech literacy, or income, which also translates to tech access. And I think some of the conversations I had last night, I found it interesting that how foundations are starting to think about the understanding what types of investments and which types of grantees are most effective. Trying to understand the psychographic profiles, for example, of founders, something VCs have done. And I wonder if there's something about thinking along the lines of what kind of citizens might be most amenable to adopting the tools that we are working on. How politically active are they already? How politically aware? Where are they located? And so I think there's, to what Brian was saying, I think a lot more potential for further segmentation of the, left part of this diagram. And then once we identify perhaps what psychographics, which I know, the human factors are always a bit fuzzy, and I think so, a bit more, I think, scary sometimes, but I think we can start thinking about what types of initiatives might be able to then serve citizens to allow them to become, to have the skill sets or the awareness to be able to use these tools. So for example, the OpenGov for the rest of us, I think is really interesting, but I think it's currently focused, as I understand, on tech skills. Yeah, so I think, that was just the point I wanted to make. And I think to what you were saying earlier about making this more dynamic, I notice a lot of folks here, I think, Greg, for example, or others that I've been speaking to, weren't in government because they wanted to work in government. They started sort of, at this end of the spectrum, then moved along until they were, on the right-hand side. And so I wonder whether the supply and demand, dichotomy, that linear way of looking at it is, the most helpful approach to think about it, because people transition, I think, a lot now, moving around these as they're trying to understand what ways they can be most effective. So yeah.
Good, thanks. With these people on the ground.
Taryn Roach, thank you.
Roach.
So I wanted just to make a comment. I think there's been a lot of discussion around the goal of this movement, and I think it's a great question to raise, what will we get out of this in 5 years? And I would almost see, based on that and based on almost a consensus I'm hearing in the room about sort of improving that citizens and users would actually be in the center rather than technology. I really see technology as a tool with this, but why is the tool in the middle, I guess is my question.
Yeah.
And then to respond to Panthea's point, OpenGov for the rest of us is really not about tech. I mean, there was a foundational level with BTOP, so we've started that work, but it's really about citizen engagement around data, around tools, and then really using those tools as a leverage point to kind of influence political will. I mean, we've been talking lately in Chicago, there's sort of two emerging narratives. One is the launch of the bike share program, and the other is that there were 73 shootings last weekend in the city. So how do we take this city that's really becoming a tale of two cities and use technology to influence the political will to change the dynamic?
Okay, very good. Another Mark Meckler runs Citizens for Self-Governance, and again, looking at it from the citizen standpoint.
So I have a question. There seems to be in the materials and in preparing for this and in the discussions we're having here an underlying premise that government is open to being open. and I've had this conversation with a few people who are here already, and I don't think any of us actually believe that. I mean, the experience is otherwise. I think there are people in government, certainly, who are open to being open, but most of the people that I cross paths with, or the activists I cross paths with, that they go seek information from, they're not really interested in making information public. For good reason. A natural reason is, most of us who want we want to criticize them for doing something wrong, or we believe we have a way to help them improve. I don't think that's built into the culture of governance in this country, though. Mostly what they want to do is do their jobs and be left alone to do their jobs. And the idea that a bunch of citizens are going to be looking over their shoulders and telling them how to do their jobs better is not currently built into the culture of governance in this country. So I think we have a governance culture issue if we want to make OpenGov endemic throughout our system.
Okay, and we're gonna, the next, but first we have Kathy Conrad, who's with the U.S. Government General Services Administration. So right off the bat, you have a little challenge there.
Talk about that later, and I think it's a very compelling question that needs to be answered. I wanted to come back to almost where we started with Stefan and then build on what Alyssa said and what Taryn said. I do think it's helpful to look at this from a citizen-centric point of view in terms of what problems are we solving and how are we using both the stakeholders who we've outlined and technology. But part of what I think we need to figure out how to do better is capture impact. Because in order to make this relevant to citizens, in order for citizens to understand why they ought to use government data or open data, and how they ought to try to engage in a government environment, they need to understand why it's relevant to them, how will it improve their lives. And at least from my perspective, we have a lot of anecdotal information, and the same anecdotes get used and overused, but we don't have the diversity of anecdotes, particularly from those of you working at the municipal level, that I think are more relevant to most people's lives than the overused examples that they hear all the time.
Okay, very good. Waldo Jackwith.
I want to mention
He's with the State Decoded.
I want to mention a procedural problem that I think we're going to be encountering down the line, that there are a lot of projects, some of which I'm involved in, to take existing government websites or government data sources that we say, this is not so good and we can do better than this, pull the data off of it and launch a better State Decoded, and then local sites like Richmond Sunlight and Open Bama. There are lots of efforts like this, and they're really great. And so the result is you can take what can be really solid government data that's presented in a really basically useless way and present it in a much better format. The problem we have here is what's known in source code control as the rebase, that with the passage of time, these private websites, as they get more complex and government does whatever they do, we eventually want to get to the point that Max Ogden was describing, in which citizens can make that pull request, where they can propose that change to the government website, so that rather than us working on our own independent websites, we can work to improve the government website instead. But the gap between where we're at now and where we'll eventually be at then is going to involve some pretty uncomfortable conversations between people like me and I use this word in the kindest of manners, the bureaucrats who run websites like this, where they're going to have to sit down with a long-haired bearded guy like Max and say, you want to do what with our website? And the longer that we go until it's possible to issue those pull requests, the more difficult it's going to be to reconcile some really great private websites with some really backward government websites. So I'd like to keep an eye on the importance of reaching that ultimate goal sooner rather than later, because otherwise private enterprise is going to make a real mess out of the attempt to for all of the right reasons, to reconcile those changes back with the government status quo.
Jessica Lord,
Try and make sense, hopefully make sense of what's in my head, but this map, I think, to me, can be generalized in a way that there's government and there's people, and at some point in history, and right now I'm generalizing and probably should do more research, but at some point in history, was the same way that a business was run, and the way that governments communicated together was the same way that a person communicated with their friends or their family. But over time, yeah, like technology is a huge part of this, because technology has changed and it's changing really fast, but that culture is absolutely tied to technology, because as technology changed, the culture changed. It made us accept that technology is going to change fast. We're more willing to accept new technologies, and
we now have new expectations of the way we're going to communicate with each other. So outside of government, in the way businesses are run and the way people interact with each other, that technology and that culture has changed at a rate completely different than the way it's changed in government. And that's what's left us where we are today, where there is a giant gulf between government and the way it operates and the way we are now used to operating with each other. And so I think a lot of like what we're doing here and a lot of what most of us spend our working days talking about is resolving that gulf. And I think the future depends on resolving that gulf as well. And
So Brian Sivek, do you?
Yeah, I mean, it's easy for a government employee to do things that have already been not being done or could be done, because there's risk inherent in doing anything new, and there's zero incentive for government employees to actually take chances, right? Especially if you're a career employee that is theoretically there for the long haul. And so the incentives are all backwards, and that's the really difficult part about changing culture inside of government, I think, is adjusting those. Is it okay if I address one other thing? So those of you who know me know that I like sort of tangible deliverables, things that come out of gatherings like this that we can actually do. And I've been thinking a lot about the question that Clay asked yesterday for the first time to me and repeated here, which is, if everything goes right for you in the next 5 years, what does the world look like? And so as we've been talking, I've been thinking about this phrase, open government, and it's a very sort of amorphous phrase that it has lots of different definitions. And I think if I'm reading this correctly, there's a beginning of a definition of open government in the upper left-hand corner of this. But what's missing is a tangible, measurable, time-bound metric or goal that we can all achieve. And I think it would be pretty cool if we could come out of this with a set of tangible things that we could try to achieve in the next 5 years. Getting groups of citizens engaged in a certain, thing by a certain period of time, and ways to actually measure that stuff so that we know that we're sort of on the right track and doing the right things. Otherwise, I feel like we're kind of, shooting arrows all over the place and hoping one lands in the right spot. This really hit home for me in my past job when I was working for Governor O'Malley in Maryland. He has had nearly 16 years now of managing massive bureaucracies and has figured out a really interesting way of doing it simply by setting a few very specific, very time-bound, very measurable goals and following up on them religiously. And guess what? It works. Like, the state does things that he wants it to do. And so I think it would be pretty neat if we could come out of this with a set of measurable objectives that people would agree on, that we could kind of focus on and do interesting things to help achieve.
Okay, I'm going to some people who want to speak again. You've had a chance already. I'll call on you to do so. Let me just kind of summarize, I think, where we are, and then have you all speak. If you still have your card up and you don't want to speak again, just put it down. Sometimes people forget to put it down. But if it's still up and you want to speak again, that's fine. I'll call on you shortly. But I think the challenge was, what is this all about? And Clay, you raised the challenge. Brian, it's great that you can point out in the top of that upper left corner of that map, they did try to give what the goals are and what is the open government initiatives. I'm just going to read it for a second because I think it's worth us thinking about it. To seek and improve relationships between citizens and government by providing transparency and data access, and improve services, access, quality, and efficiency. And then it goes on, better connections between citizens and their government and what it should engender. And I think Brian is making a very positive suggestion that, if you have these goals, how do you measure them? And over the next 3 days, we can refine the goals and we can measure. But I think, in essence, it's what we're tackling here is the essence of self-governance itself. What is citizenship? What is governance? And, these are the tools then for enabling that, for informed citizens so they can act as citizens, and then to engage with the decision-making process. It's also to help with the functions of government in terms of providing the services that government normally provides. A number of things have been brought out, including that it's not all technology. It can be innovations in techniques. It can be, you can have engagement that is not technologically mediated. That we need to think about nonprofits and the for-profit sector for ways of, creating incentives for these intermediaries to make this information available and to encourage involvement. And as I said, we need to, earlier I said, we need the narrative, we need the marketing, we need the stories that make this real so that people can understand why it is, if they're not normally used to engaging in their governmental processes, why it's really important, and maybe now as much or more than ever. So having said that, let me go back to the people who still have their cards up. Then I'm going to turn to Gavin Starks, who will tell us at least how the UK has started to address that. So I'll just move along. Clay?
Hi, thanks. I want to just give as much of a +1 to what Waldo said about the tensions between this idea of sort of offloading the sort of interface responsibility to private industry through open data. If you look at actually what's happened with these, so eloquently put, same stupid narratives, stories of success that we. If you look at, for instance, the weather industry, right? Like, AccuWeather actively hates government data, right? They made Rick Santorum put a bill in front of the Senate to try and shut down NOAA. They don't want it anymore. They're angry at them. They're like the private industry of weather and the public sector of weather are at strong odds against one another, and I think that's important to sort of recognize if we're sort of looking at our historical predecessors.
And why is that? Is that
because they feel like they can do it
competing?
better, and they feel like they get their toes stepped on. They feel like they could create more jobs and blah 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 blah. Yeah. They're. I mean, that's what I mean. I mean, it's
so they were spawned by government essentially.
Yeah,
they
and
got
but now they feel like,
the
okay,
impetus.
we've sort of outgrown you.
Yeah.
We don't need you anymore.
Okay.
And I think that I don't know whether that's reasonable or not. That's not for me to decide. But I mean, if their conferences are online streamed just like this one. If you look at them, they're not friends. The second thing I wanted to point out, because everyone's sort of just talking about my sort of 5-year plan, for lack of a better phrase. I really don't want to turn this into a conversation about some massive goal for all of us to have that sort of one shared goal, because I think that also is not a good idea for a variety, because getting this group to work together cohesively just wouldn't work. But I think that there should be many goals, and part of the sort of marketing effort that we're talking about needs to be describing those goals well. I don't want to improve civil services for the rest of my life. What I want to do is end the line at the DMV, right? And that to me is much more appealing to get me to be involved in open government if it means, or modernizing government if it means I never have to wait in line at the DMV again, right? I don't want to put building permits online. I want to never have to wonder what the heck is going on when I'm stuck in traffic because a huge construction site is happening. I want to know what's going on there, right? I want to end that level of curiosity. I want to make it so that the next Jack Abramoff gets caught by math and doesn't get to do what he did for a year because we had to wait for a journalist to have a hunch, right? These are the stories that we need to be telling, and they're different goals, right? They're entirely different goals. I named basically 3 different goals from 3 people I sort of glanced at that I imagined would be their ultimate goal for a 5-year plan inside of this room, and I think if we all just went through that exercise and said, what would the world look like if I got to win all my fights, and then shared those with one another, then look, like DMV is not my thing, but I'm sure it's somebody's thing. Like I'm willing to help in the line at the DMV. I'm willing to help catch the next Jack Abramoff, and I'm willing to help, figure out what the heck is going on at 14th and U. But I don't get that from anybody in our community, and I wish I did. I want more of that. So that's what I mean by 5-year plans. Just the sort of Cliff Notes version of what I just said, for those of you who tuned out in my ramble, was, look, we don't need many goals, we need multiple goals, but we need to share those goals, and we need to share those long-term plans with one another.
Okay.
Good.
It's important to add some, anyway, I think you've had probably already enough input so far, but I think there are still a few concepts that may be missing from the debate, and I think those concepts really point to a shift that we have, which then actually can enable also to identify. You have to understand what you ultimately want to achieve, or what the conceptual framework is. And what we really see is a shift, and you can put that almost at the top of the map to a certain extent. We do see a shift in this debate from pure deliberation with citizens to actually active collaboration, to active co-creation, which I think is an important shift that needs to be underscored. We also see a shift to actually more evidence-based interventions, or at least a debate about how you get more evidence-based interventions, which is an important shift, which can be connected with actually something that technology enables, including big data and open data. So that's an important shift as well. We see a shift towards the adoption of principles of agility in governance, where you actually really you go in, you experiment, you learn, you experiment, you learn. And I think that adoption of agility is an important element that probably needs to be on the map as well, because it defines how you're going to start thinking about measurement. It defines about your timelines of measurement to a certain extent, because the timelines are not going to be 5 years, which is frankly way too far out to measure whether anything worked, right? And so this level of agility you need to have. You see a shift towards more decentralization as opposed to centralization of decision making. And I think those shifts would actually help to then understand where the different parts actually, to a certain extent, fit as well. So that might be the gravy on the map to a certain extent that you may want to add.
I think it's a lot of meat. I think it's more more.
Plus one, Waldo's point and Clay's point about privatization. The example in my head would have been the Postal Service. I mean, when you send an overnight package, do you use the U.S. Postal Service or do you use FedEx or UPS? And clearly they're very advanced technologically, and I think you can on the edge of bankruptcy. So here is a case of private sector competition, doing a better job, offering better services to citizens/consumers, with the outcome that long-standing government institution is in kind of dire financial straits, which to me raises the question, like, is that an essential government service? And I think that's a question I'm asking, with my company, like, what are those essential government functions? What in the cycle of innovation and technological progress, will there always be government functions that kind of slowly spin off? Maybe in the 19th century, postal delivery was something that only the federal government could accomplish, but now clearly, private entities can do that.
But Joel, do you think that Federal Express delivers mail to rural areas, that we have letter delivery that is, a carrier of last resort? Do you not see the?
I think if we turn this discussion to a debate over the.
No, I agree. I understand, but before I leave it, service that there are functions there that, in terms of that example, that are not really served by the private industry, and
I would agree
Yeah.
and especially the digital divide issue. I think we're all familiar with this issue in terms of broadband access. But my point is really a question, Charlie, like which of these services, like clearly we can all I'm pretty sure I saw chairs in a post office in the Mission in San Francisco that were the chairs I had in my elementary school, which indicates that they're like getting hand-me-downs from, maybe from school. So, you know, again, I think that the question is, you know, in this domain of civic entrepreneurship, how do we think about, you know, again, to Waldo's point, like what functions can be successfully outsourced and maybe stay separate from government, and what efforts either should stay within government or get, you know, rebased back to government.
Okay, very good.
I mean, to just sort of, I guess, partly emphasize some of what I was saying before, but in the context of what some other people have said in terms of not what Clay was saying in terms of having multiple goals. I think there's multiple narratives, and I think partly why I feel like it's important to sort of have, sort of demonstrate the complex relationship between the players in the field versus the kinds of activities that they're doing, whether it's, you know, around more sort of inclusive, collaborative decision-making or co-production of services, that the basic terminology and the language that we use in the government space, you know, there's a lot of misunderstandings about just the most basic terminology. So whether you're talking about open government as a whole and what that means, or if you're talking about transparency, and sometimes transparency is equated to open data. But I think one of the biggest tensions that we see in the space is around open government, particularly open data, for accountability and transparency versus for sort of innovation and economic development. And I feel like that kind of divide exists sort of at multiple levels in the sort of domain around open government. So I think one thing that would be really helpful to sort of pair with this map is just some basic terminology and definitions, and maybe you have multiple definitions for each term that are context specific. I mean, another example that I've come across a lot is I work a lot with data standards, but oftentimes when I'm in conversations with people about standards, they're using that term to refer to like policy standards and guidelines. And so I can't tell you how many conversations I've had about standards where I'm talking for 10 minutes before I realize the other person thinks I'm talking about something completely different. So.
Good. We'll sort that out.
Thank you. So I wanted to reference back, I think, both to Brian and Clay's points about goals with more of a question, because I do think that it's important to set some, and that there will probably be multiple. But the question that arises for me is whether the people in this room are the right people to be setting those goals. And I think practically speaking, certainly it's easier for it to be done that way. But in terms of citizens and how underdeveloped the role of citizens are in much of this discussion, and I'm not sure practically how you actualize that, but I imagine that any goals that this group sets are going to be much more fully realized if citizens play a role in informing those. And I don't know if the mechanism is, you know, something akin to deliberative polling or what that mechanism might be. But I am curious to understand how people in this room have thought about collecting that input and using that input in setting their own goals.
Well, let me just throw it back to Stefan, who deliberation to active co-creation. So, you know, how do we factor in the deliberation part and not forget that? I mean, yes, we are moving to co-creation, and that's a really important element. But what about maintaining and even enhancing deliberation, which is, you know, a perfectly important element of citizenship? Do you have any thoughts?
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm not saying that deliberation is less important, but I do see that actually, given the fact that we have now, and I think has mentioned several times, that we have now tools that actually you actually see that in addition to deliberation, citizens can also now be engaged, whether it's from a peer-to-peer or a peer-to-governance kind of environment, by actively co-creation. And I totally agree with the paradox that we have here, is that on the one hand, we're talking about engaging with citizens, on the other hand, we actually set objectives that may impact ultimately citizens. So there must be a way to think about how you go about that. Now, having said that, it doesn't mean that, again, this whole notion of citizen, it doesn't mean that this whole notion of citizen means everyone. right? And so we have to become more sophisticated about whether we talk about a curated set of citizens that actually can provide for value that then can be again validated and so on. So we have to become far more sophisticated, and that's to a certain extent also something that you may want to think in terms of the map on at which level do you want to have engagement, what kind of engagement at each level. If you think in terms of the cycle or the process, I think there are different points of engagement, whether it's about determining the goal, it's about implementing the goal, it's about finding solutions to implementations and so on. These are all functions of governance to a certain extent that require different kinds of citizens' engagement, some more deliberation, some more collaboration. So that's the only thing I want to say, because it becomes otherwise very complex.
Yeah, good. Let me just again, because we want to get to Gavin. So I can do a lightning round. For those whose their cards are up, we can just make small comments. The next person is Alyssa, Panthea, John, Tony, and Ellen, and Jessica.
So I just wanted to comment on Kelly's question, and I think at the municipal level, we have an advantage of including working with community organizations, neighborhood associations, and individual residents to identify the problem and then work from there. Actual work done, or opening up data sets or new tools that could be leveraged by that community. And so I think there is an advantage working at the municipal level, and it points out just another thing to consider in our conversations going federal open government work and municipal open government work. And so that's something to
And what
consider.
about state? What do you, of course, I'm talking about lightning round and I'm throwing back questions, but do you, is that's sort of like local? I mean, or do you see that as kind of
I see it as another level. I
Yeah.
see federal, state,
Yeah.
regional, I guess you could say.
Okay. Panthea?
If we agree, I think I hear that, we want to change the culture of government. Sense of agency and whether or not they feel they're able to participate in these processes. And so, as someone is going and trying to end the line at the DMV or trying to find out what's going on at 14th and U, can we then feed those lessons back to each other and share those about, what was it about how we engaged in this process that made it more effective or not? And, we can all, disperse and do it differently, but then come back to, having some kind of conversation about what it was that worked or not. And I think that, we try and do that at, in very small ways, but I think we're seeing differences in when our partners are grassroots activists versus management consultants, whether we're seconding staff to the government agency or working as an external consultant. And so we're trying to experiment on ourselves and trying to understand what model kind of makes sense for, these different projects. And I think, that might be something worth exploring.
Okay. Tony?
I was just going to contribute that at the state level, when we're talking about the specific goals, one of the projects my organization has been asked to do by the state of Colorado is document the state's process to improve their transparency online portal for the state of Colorado. And definitely what's driving them, the only motivation for them is the U.S. They grade each state on their transparency, their level of transparency, and they do have a specific set of criteria, that they're measuring and evaluating each state on, and I think that's a pretty good place to start, because it is having impact. And in my conversations with the Comptroller's Office of the state of Colorado, that is the #1 motivator for them. Their grade keeps getting lower and lower. They were a D, they got a D grade this year, and that is what's motivating them.
Well, it is true. Report cards actually do always, it's always kind of surprising. I'm going to go to Ellen and then finish up with John Bracken.
I also wanted to respond to Kelly. I think there's something in the human-centric design world that certainly Sunlight's going to explore in more depth. But to me, there's a emerging of that traditional. You ask people what they want, and you give them what they want, how they want it. That strikes me as sort of the traditional way of to find not only, in my case, the likely voters, but if they had the information, more likely voters, and even the tier below. So the challenge is to be, scientifically approach this, and to say, what do you want to know, and give citizens that, but also figure out other things that you might, sort of work into that app or that, accessible bit of data or information, so that they find things that they didn't know they needed to know, but now they're addicted to having it. So we're going to be doing a lot of exploration around this human-centered design work, and I do think there's a part of the answers in that as well.
Okay, very good. This round.
I've captured, I think, 7 sort of tension or kind of fault lines I've heard over the morning, and actually dating back to yesterday afternoon. One, the local-federal tension, the difference at working at both those levels, the difference of the cultures, the difference of the opportunities, the difference versus not engaged. Ellen's point around voting is a pretty key metric around engagement, so voters, non-voters. The notion also, as we think about citizens as consumers versus as co-creators, some of the products around the table are aimed very much thinking about citizens as consumers and how can we get better services and data to them to consume. Others, I think, we're thinking a little bit more abstract, but about how we co-create, how we rethink the relationship with government. Insider-outsider tensions. So with a couple of notable exceptions, all of us in the room right now are living outside of government and thinking about ways we can try to help it innovate and get better. I don't think we do a really, speaking as an outsider, I don't think we have had a really conscious process or set of curriculum to try to think about how we can help the people working inside more effectively and intentionally. Big, small government tensions are present, and I think with all of us, right? We're all trying to figure out what's the right scale. And then the last one is the one that I heard Phil identify, which is the sort of, I don't know what the right category is, but what he phrased it, accountability, transparency, sort of the exposing information versus the more building aspect of how do we drive economic development and government innovation. One other thing that I didn't hear is I don't think I've heard the word mobile used at all morning. Someone on Twitter said maybe that's a good thing, and maybe it's just because it's so intrinsic to all of our thinking already, but it just struck me that it hasn't even been mentioned.
And is there any other point? I have this screen up there. I'm not following the Twitter stream, but if there's any other point, maybe, Mike, that you want to bring out from Twitter, this might be a great time. Because what I think we'll do is just summarize this and then take a break and then start with the next session with talking about, okay, here we are. We've talked about the importance of using technology and beyond in order to make more effective governance, whether it's government services, deliberation, engagement, even private enterprise that expands its opportunities and development from the use of government data. We've got a lot of different ways that open governance and open government and open data can improve our lives, and we've gone through that, I think, in some detail and some variety. We've seen that that there are, there's this inclination, and I think this group is one that you would expect that. In fact, you would expect this group, because it's a very technological group around the table, you would expect maybe a map that it created would say technology is the fulcrum. But this group, interestingly enough, is saying, no, we need to go, not look just at the technology. It is a tool. We have to constantly remember that. But it's an important tool, and it is transforming, and it is something that we do, we do and can use to change the whole nature of how we're able to co-create our governance. And then I think John very ably at the end gave us our tensions and fault lines for how we're going to consider these things going forward. That said, any other points from Twitter that we should?
Not so much. I mean, there's some on Twitter that mostly rah-rahing the notion of citizens as consumers and building things for that. One of the things I would add, one point that I think that I heard this morning that is another tension, which is that the most important aspects of open government are often the most mundane, and that's a struggle, I think, around all of this, is that the things that we see the possibilities for are often the things that are the most detailed and specific and not as exciting from a consumer standpoint, but again, that tension arising there. So.
Okay, so what we're going to do is break. Tricia, are we going to do a group photo? So we're going to go in the back and follow Tricia Kelly, who's our project manager and our assistant director, and she will organize us into a group photo. And then we have actually 30 minutes, so we will be back at 11 o'clock sharp to begin our discussion with how the UK is dealing with these issues, and then what are some of the barriers to achieving them. Thank you.